These are 6 World War II tanks that failed so spectacularly, they make modern military blunders look like minor hiccups. From a New Zealand farming minister's corrugated iron death trap to Hitler's bridge-crushing monster that couldn't cross bridges, these armored disasters prove that sometimes the best intentions create the worst possible outcomes. Let's start with what might be the most lovably pathetic tank ever built, New Zealand's Bob Semple tank.
Public Works Minister Bob Semple has built a tank using a Caterpillar tractor and corrugated steel.
Picture this scene. It's 1940. The fall of France has cut New Zealand off from British tank supplies, and Bob Semple, the Minister of Works, decides he can build better tanks using whatever's lying around. Working without any formal plans or blueprints, just an American postcard showing a tractor conversion, Semple and his team created what can only be described as a shed on tracks. The Bob Semple tank was built on a Caterpillar D8 tractor chassis and covered in corrugated iron. Yes, the same stuff you'd use for a barn roof. At 12 feet tall, this towering monument to improvisation was armed with 6 Bren light machine guns scattered around the hull. One poor gunner had to lie on a mattress on top of the engine to fire his weapon, presumably while being slowly cooked by engine heat and deafened by the noise. The engineering was as questionable as you'd expect. This 25-ton beast could reach a whopping 15 miles per hour, but here's the kicker. It had to come to a complete stop to change gears. Imagine trying to retreat under fire and having to politely pause your escape to shift from second to third gear. The tractor gearing created such intense vibrations that accurately firing the guns while moving was virtually impossible, which rather defeats the point of a mobile weapons platform. When the first tank cost nearly 6,000 pounds, enough to buy 9 proper light tanks, and the Army was only billed for a fraction of that cost, you know the government wasn't exactly confident in their investment. After 3 tanks were built and promptly attracted public ridicule, Bob Semple stood by his creation, declaring, "I don't see anyone else coming up with any better ideas." The tanks were quietly disposed of, but Semple's defiant spirit had at least given New Zealanders a symbol of scrappy determination, even if it couldn't actually fight. Now, if the Bob Semple represents enthusiastic amateurism, Germany's Panzer VIII Maus represents the opposite extreme, over-engineering taken to absolutely ridiculous levels. Hitler wanted the biggest, most powerful tank imaginable, and by God, he got it. The Maus weighed 188 tons, making it 3 times heavier than a modern Abrams tank. At 33 feet long and 12 feet wide, this mechanical monstrosity was so massive, it holds the record as the heaviest fully enclosed tank ever built. The problem started immediately. Despite being designed for 20 miles per hour, the Maus could barely manage 8 miles per hour in actual testing. It had a range of just over 100 miles on roads, and less than half that cross-country. But here's where it gets truly absurd. The Maus was too heavy for any bridge or railway tunnel in Europe. The solution? It was supposed to drive underwater using a snorkel system to cross rivers. Hitler initially wanted it to ford 45-foot deep rivers, though reality eventually dictated a more modest 25-foot maximum. The logistics were a nightmare. Transportation required a specialized 14-axle railway car, and moving these beasts to the front would have been nearly impossible. During testing, engines failed due to broken crankshafts, and the electrical drivetrain proved unreliable. By the time Soviet forces overran the testing grounds in April 1945, only 2 prototypes existed. One of these mechanical monsters is now on display at the Kubinka Tank Museum in Russia. Hitler had originally wanted 150 of these monsters, but sanity eventually prevailed, and the order was canceled. The Maus never saw combat, which is probably the only sensible thing about its entire development story. The Soviet Union's T-35 land battleship represents another kind of madness. The belief that more turrets automatically means better tank. This 58-ton behemoth was the only 5-turreted heavy tank to reach production, armed with one 76mm gun, 2 45mm guns, and multiple machine guns. On paper, it could engage enemies in every direction simultaneously. In reality, it was a coordination nightmare that one commander couldn't effectively control. Soviet tanker Ivan Smolyakov described it perfectly. This T-35 was not sugar. It was a very heavy and complex vehicle. They broke down often, especially the transmission was a problem. The tank had to be inspected after every 30 miles of driving because something would inevitably break. Fan belts, clutches, reduction gears, everything failed with depressing regularity. The T-35 was so mechanically unreliable that crews often abandoned perfectly functional tanks rather than risk being stranded behind enemy lines. When Operation Barbarossa began in 1941, the Red Army had 58 T-35s, with 48 supposedly combat-ready. Within months, 90% were lost, not to German guns, but to mechanical failures at engagements like the Battle of Brody. These expensive propaganda pieces, costing enough to buy 9 lighter tanks each, proved utterly useless when actually needed. A few even ended up in German hands, captured intact when their crews simply walked away from yet another breakdown. Italy's M1340 medium tank, built by Fiat Ansaldo, shows how good intentions can create dangerous mediocrity. Designed to be Italy's primary battle tank, the M1340 suffered from almost every possible flaw. The armor was riveted rather than welded, meaning that when struck, loose bolts became deadly projectiles inside the crew compartment. If that wasn't enough, the tanks had a disturbing tendency to burst into flames when hit. Most Italian tank units in North Africa lacked radios, making coordination impossible. Crews received just 25 days of training before being shipped to the desert, where the inadequate air filters and cooling systems made the M1340 even more unreliable. The armor was brittle and prone to shattering, while the main gun was ineffective against enemy armor. The humiliation was complete when 6 M1340s were destroyed one by a single British 2-pounder anti-tank gun. The crews couldn't even communicate the danger to each other. Japan's Type 95 Heigo light tank, built by Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, might win the award for most creative vulnerabilities. With armor ranging from 6 to 12 millimeters thick, it couldn't protect against small arms fire, let alone anti-tank weapons. American Marines discovered they could disable these tanks with Molotov cocktails thrown into the air intake or jam the turret rotation with an ordinary infantry knife. The interior was lined with asbestos, making the tank dangerous to its crew even when not under fire. When deployed to muddy Pacific islands, Type 95s immediately became bogged down and abandoned. The first 2 tanks sent to Milne Bay in New Guinea were stuck in mud within days and never recovered. By 1944, these obsolete machines were helpless against bazookas, anti-tank rifles, and even heavy machine gun fire. Finally, Britain's A-38 Valiant proves that even late in the war, terrible tank design was still possible. Intended as a heavily armored assault tank for the Far East, the Valiant achieved its armor goals but at an unacceptable cost everywhere else. On the first day of testing, after just 13 miles of easy road driving, the trials were abandoned. The driver was exhausted from fighting steering levers that required his full body weight to operate, while the seat, foot brake, and gear lever all posed injury risks during normal operation. One evaluation officer described it as quite the worst tank I have ever sat in. The Valiant was so fundamentally flawed that it was eventually